Imagine working hard all year, earning money for your country, only to be told that half of it has to be sent to another country before you can even use the rest. Sounds unfair, right? Well, that's exactly what's been happening to several African nations for decades. Here's how it works. Many African countries, especially those that were once under French colonial rule, have been required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France under a system called the CFA franc. And guess what? This reserve isn't just sitting there in cash, it's mostly stored in gold. In simple terms, these countries make money, but before they can use it for things like building roads, schools or hospitals, half of it has to be handed over to France. The remaining half, that's what they have to survive on. But wait, it doesn't end there. Some African nations have also been storing their gold reserves in the United States, specifically at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Why? Because after falling into heavy debt from institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, they were forced to use their gold as collateral, basically as a guarantee for the money they borrowed. Here's the shocking part. That gold has never been returned. Now imagine the frustration. Countries that should be thriving are instead stuck in a cycle where they owe money, can't access their own wealth, and have little control over their financial future. But something big is happening. Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, is making bold moves to take back control of his country's gold and foreign exchange reserves. And he's not alone. The real question is, which other countries are joining him? How exactly is this happening? And how is the West reacting? Before we dive into that, let's rewind a bit to understand the roots of this system and why it exists in the first place. When many African nations gained independence, France didn't just pack up and leave. Instead, it put a system in place to keep financial control over its former colonies. This system is called the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries split into two groups. West African Economic and Monetary Union, WWAMU, includes Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. Central African Economic and Monetary Community, CEMAC, includes Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Each of these countries still operates under a system that ties them to France's financial policies, limiting their ability to make independent economic decisions. But here's where things are starting to change. Imagine having a wallet full of money, but every time you want to use it, you have to ask someone else for permission. And most of the time, they say no. That's exactly what's been happening to several African countries for decades. Even though these nations have their own central banks, they don't actually control their own money. Here's why. A system put in place by France forces these countries to send at least half of their foreign currency reserves to the French treasury. That means before African nations can even use their own wealth for things like schools, roads or hospitals, half of it is locked away in Paris, completely out of their reach. And it gets worse. Most of this reserve isn't even stored as cash. It's kept in gold, but not in African vaults, not in their own banks in France. This setup ensured that while African farmers, workers and businesses generated wealth, a huge chunk of it was never kept in their own countries. Instead, it quietly slipped away into France's economy, making sure France stayed rich while Africa remained dependent. But that was only part of the plan. While this financial system, the CFA franc system, already kept African economies tied to France, the real exploitation happened through gold. See, many African countries are sitting on massive amounts of gold. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire are among the world's top gold producers. You'd think that would mean prosperity for their people, right? Not quite. Instead of benefiting their own nations, this gold was automatically shipped off to Paris, long before it could be counted, taxed, or used for local development. How did France pull this off? First, they ensured that French companies dominated Africa's gold mining industry. These companies extracted massive amounts of gold while paying barely anything in return. So even before governments could claim a share, most of the gold was already gone. Second, France forced these nations to store whatever gold reserves they did have in Paris, claiming it was necessary to guarantee the stability of their currency. But here's the catch. African governments couldn't access or use this gold without France's approval. Imagine working hard every day, only to realize that your money's sitting in someone else's bank account, and they won't let you withdraw it. That's the reality these African nations have been living with for decades. And as if that wasn't enough, France designed the CFA franc to be permanently tied to its own currency. First, it was pegged to the French franc, and later to the euro. This meant African economies had zero flexibility. Their currency's value was dictated by decisions made in Europe, not by their own governments. These countries weren't just stuck with a currency they didn't fully control. They also had no power to adjust its value or manage their own financial policies. If any leader even tried to use their country's gold reserves to support their own economy, they were immediately blocked. But this wasn't just unfair, it was a way to keep African nations dependent, a system designed to make sure they could never truly break free from France's grip. And whenever someone dared to challenge it, the consequences were brutal. Take Thomas Sankara, for example. Sankara was the president of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, and he had a bold vision. He wanted his country to be truly independent, not just politically, but financially. He demanded the return of Burkina Faso's gold reserves, wanted to nationalize gold mining, and even planned to create a currency that wasn't controlled by France. And he wasn't just talking. Unlike other African leaders who took loans from the IMF and World Bank, which often kept countries trapped in debt, Sankara refused. That made him a problem. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup led by Blaise Compaoré, a leader backed by France. The moment Compaoré took power, he erased everything Sankara stood for. The gold stayed in French vaults, the economy fell back under French influence, and Burkina Faso was once again locked into the same system Sankara had tried to escape. But he wasn't the only one who fought back. Another leader who tried to break free was Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of Côte d'Ivoire. Gbagbo believed that his country's gold should be used to develop Côte d'Ivoire, not sit in French banks making France richer. He openly questioned why an independent nation should have to store its wealth in another country. France didn't like that. Suddenly, Gbagbo was accused of election fraud, and in 2011, things took a shocking turn. French troops intervened directly, removed him from power, and handed him over to the International Criminal Court. Just like that, he was eliminated, and France made sure a pro-French leader took his place, one who wouldn't ask too many questions. For years, African nations struggled to resist because they were tied to the West, politically, economically, and even militarily. The system wasn't just about money, it was about control. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta, Mali, and Abdourahmane Tiani, Niger, are taking bold steps to reclaim their country's financial independence. One of their first major moves, expelling French troops and tearing up old military agreements that kept them under foreign control. But this fight isn't just about military presence, it's about money, resources, and power. With France no longer calling the shots, these nations are demanding the return of their gold reserves, gold that's been locked away in European vaults for years. And they're not stopping there, they're exploring gold-backed financial systems, moving away from outdated currencies that kept them tied to Western interests. This isn't just a technical policy shift, it's a bold statement of economic freedom, and they're not alone. Other African nations, like Nigeria, are making their own moves. Nigeria has started pulling back its gold reserves from foreign banks, partly due to concerns about the instability of the US financial system. Meanwhile, global heavyweights like Russia and China are backing Africa's push for economic independence. The BRICS alliance has been pushing for a world where countries trade without relying on the US dollar, encouraging African nations to ditch Western-controlled financial systems and embrace gold-backed currencies instead. This shift is shaking up France's economy in a big way. Without African resources propping it up, France is facing serious financial trouble. And that's why they're desperately trying to stop this movement, using every trick in the book. They've already started economic blackmail, cutting off financial aid to Mali and Burkina Faso, hoping to create economic chaos and force them back into the old system. But it doesn't stop there. Western media has launched a smear campaign, painting leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and Assimi Goïta as dictators, a classic strategy used to justify sanctions, political pressure, or even future military interventions. And given France's long history of orchestrating coups in Africa, There's growing concern that they might try again, especially in Burkina Faso or Mali. But France isn't the only power with its hands in Africa's wealth. For years, Africa's gold reserves haven't just been locked away in France, they've also been held in the United States, particularly in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. At first glance, it might seem like African governments willingly stored their gold there. But the truth is much darker. These nations weren't given a real choice. They were forced into this arrangement through their dependence on the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, two institutions that have played a massive role in keeping African economies trapped in debt. The system was designed to keep African nations borrowing, struggling, and under Western control. But now, for the first time in decades, that system is being challenged. Imagine needing money to build roads, schools, or hospitals, but the only way to get it is by borrowing from someone who makes all the rules and ensures you never fully break free from their grip. That's exactly what happened to many African nations. Whenever these countries needed funds for development, stabilizing their economies, or even running basic public services, they had to turn to global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. But these weren't just ordinary loans, they came with strings attached, big ones. The conditions imposed by these lenders made sure that Africa remained financially dependent. Instead of allowing countries to grow on their own terms, these loans tied them to policies that weakened their economies, kept them in debt, and left them vulnerable to foreign influence. And the worst part, repayment was designed to be nearly impossible. The cycle of borrowing, struggling, and borrowing again ensured Africa stayed in a position of economic subordination. If you are still watching this video, it means you love it. Why not take out a second and hit that like button? Have you done that? Let us move on. Imagine playing a game where the odds are stacked against you from the start. No matter how hard you try, the rules keep changing, always in favour of the people in charge. That's exactly how many African nations were trapped in a financial system designed to keep them dependent, struggling, and controlled. One of the biggest tricks used against them was currency devaluation. Countries were forced to weaken their own money, making it harder to trade with the rest of the world. This meant African economies stayed stuck at the bottom, always at a disadvantage in global market. But that was just the beginning. Governments were also pressured to cut funding for basic services, like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Schools crumbled, hospitals lacked resources, and roads remained unpaved. Not because African nations didn't want to develop, but because they were told they couldn't afford it under the conditions of their loans. And then came the biggest heist of all. African governments were forced to sell off state-owned industries, like energy, telecommunications, and mining, for shockingly low prices. But guess who bought them up? Western corporations. In the end, African nations didn't just lose money, they lost control over their own resources and industries. But perhaps the most ruthless demand was the requirement to store their financial reserves as collateral, specifically in gold. This wasn't just about securing loans. African nations had to physically ship their gold to the United States, with most of it ending up at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They were told this was only temporary, that the gold would be returned once their economies improved. That never happened. Even after repaying their debts, African countries were met with endless legal barriers whenever they tried to reclaim their own gold. The agreements were designed in such a way that breaking free from debt was nearly impossible. If a country managed to clear its dues, new financial hurdles magically appeared, keeping them locked in a cycle of dependence. This system ensured that wealth continued to flow out of Africa, while Western financial institutions remained in control. It wasn't just about money, it was about keeping African nations in check, forcing them to follow economic policies that benefited the West at their expense. But the tide is turning. For the first time in decades, African nations are fighting back. Leaders across the continent are making bold moves to reclaim their gold, a direct challenge to the financial dominance of the West. Countries like Nigeria have started withdrawing their reserves from the US, driven by fears that the global financial system is becoming too unstable. Ghana is now prioritizing storing its gold at home, aiming to strengthen its currency and reduce its reliance on foreign lenders like the IMF. Meanwhile, South Africa, a key BRICS nation, has been steadily building up its gold reserves, signaling a long-term plan to move away from the US dollar. And Egypt, a major economic player, has begun relocating its reserves to gain more control over its economy and reduce foreign interference. This isn't just about moving gold from one place to another, it's a revolutionary shift, one that threatens to shake up the global financial order. Across Africa, a financial revolution is unfolding, and at the center of it all is Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fearless leader of Burkina Faso. Unlike many past African leaders who hesitated to directly confront financial dependence on the West, Traoré isn't asking for permission. He's taking action. Since coming to power in 2022, he's made bold decisions that have shaken Western institutions and ignited a wave of economic nationalism across Africa. His first move, kicking out French troops and tearing up military agreements that allowed foreign powers to dictate Burkina Faso's security policies. With France out of the picture, Traoré turned his attention to something even bigger: Burkina Faso's gold. For years, French corporations dominated Burkina Faso's gold mining industry, extracting enormous wealth, while the local population saw little benefit. Traoré put an end to that. He took back control of the mines, ensuring that profits stayed within the country instead of lining foreign bank accounts. But his most historic move was his demand to bring back Burkina Faso's gold reserves from both France and the United States. For decades, African nations have been required to store their financial reserves, including gold, in Western banks, making them dependent on foreign-controlled financial systems. By reclaiming this wealth, Traoré is setting a powerful example for the rest of Africa, and other countries are following his lead. Mali and Niger, both of which recently removed pro-French governments, are aligning with Traoré's vision of a self-sufficient Africa, free from foreign economic dominance. What once seemed impossible, African nations standing together against Western financial control, is happening right now. And this has Washington and Paris deeply worried. On the surface, bringing gold back home might seem like just another financial decision, but in reality, it's a direct challenge to the way Western powers have controlled African economies for decades. Gold reserves are more than just assets. They have been used as leverage by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to force African countries into policies that benefit the West. If African nations control their own gold, they no longer have to play by those rules. And it doesn't stop there. This movement is also a serious threat to the dominance of the US dollar. Many of the countries repatriating their gold, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and more, are either part of BRICS or seeking to join. The BRICS alliance has been actively working on a gold-backed currency, which would shake the foundations of Western financial power. If successful, this new system could reduce global dependence on the US dollar, a shift that Washington cannot afford to ignore. And if history tells us anything, it's that whenever African nations try to reclaim control over their own wealth, the West doesn't just sit back and watch. The battle for Africa's financial independence is heating up, and the stakes couldn't be higher. As more African nations demand the return of their gold, the possibility of Western retaliation is becoming very real. History has shown that when African leaders try to break free from financial control, the response is swift and ruthless. Take Muammar Gaddafi, for example. He had a bold vision, a gold-backed African currency that would free the continent from Western financial dominance. But the moment he pushed forward with his plan, NATO forces invaded Libya, and his government was toppled. Now, Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahamane Tiani are leading a new movement to reclaim Africa's wealth. But with every step they take toward financial sovereignty, they risk facing the same tactics that have been used to crush African independence in the past: sanctions, political interference, economic pressure. Even military intervention isn't off the table. The West has too much to lose if Africa controls its own resources, and history has proven that they won't let go without a fight. But this time things feel different. The decision to repatriate gold isn't just about economics, it's about reclaiming power. It's about shutting the door on financial slavery and finally putting Africa's wealth to work for its own people, not foreign interests. The question is, how far will the West go to stop this movement? Will they try to use sanctions and economic blackmail? Will they attempt to destabilize governments that refuse to comply? Or will they take even more drastic measures, like orchestrating military interventions? One thing is certain: Africa isn't waiting for permission anymore. For the first time in decades, African leaders are standing up to a system that has kept the continent financially dependent for generations. The old order is crumbling, and a new era is emerging, one where Africa's wealth stays